I'm Terry, and I say a lot on my YouTube channel that I'm conservative for a reason. And well, that's not exactly true. I'm conservative for a lot of reasons, but they kind of all boil down to one place. I'm conservative because I study history. And today I'm going to want to pass a little bit of history along to you, and we're going to talk about the Second Amendment. And the reason that I want to pass some history down to you is because there are a lot of misunderstandings that are just basic, and if we understood history, we would never make these mistakes. I want to start with a quote from Ronald Reagan from his Time for Choosing speech in 1964. Reagan said, "The trouble with our liberal friends is not that they're ignorant, it's just that they know so much that isn't so." I hear a lot from my liberal friends about what is meant by the Second Amendment. It just isn't so, and they're so sure of it. Well, I want to talk about what's actually so about the Second Amendment, and I want to do that by looking at what the founders actually meant, and we can know that because they gave speeches that were recorded for posterity, not on a machine, but they were written down and published. We have a lot of quotes from them. They were all prolific writers. I'm not going to try and be exhaustive in any area. I'm only going to give you enough to make my point. Trust me, I've got more quotes than you can shake a stick at about the Second Amendment. And I'm going to start with a general quotation from Thomas Jefferson that I've used before. It's one of my favorites. He wrote a letter to William Johnson on June 12, 1823, and he said, "On every occasion of constitutional interpretation, let us carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted, recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying to force what meaning may be squeezed out of the text or invented against it, instead, let us conform to the probable one in which it was passed." And what he was saying was that we meant some very simple, plain things when we wrote it. We wrote it in very simple, plain language. Lawyers, even at that time in 1823, had gotten in and twisted it around and put words in there that weren't there. That's why I'm interested in the Constitution and not constitutional law. The Constitution does a fine job of safeguarding our liberties. Constitutional law, this body of mess we call constitutional law, has mangled that. Find out what it really means and keep going back to it, because everything the government does or doesn't do should always trace back to the Constitution. So now I give you the Second Amendment of the Constitution. "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." Notice that there are no semicolons, no periods, only commas. This is one contiguous thought. "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." Now, what I want to break that down to is the component phrases and talk about each one in the founders' own words. The first phrase is a well-regulated militia. What does a well-regulated militia mean? A lot of my liberal friends say that means the National Guard, that means this, that means that. I'm going to tell you what it meant to the founders, okay? George Mason said in his address to the Virginia Ratifying Convention on June 4, 1788, "I ask, who are the militia? They consist now of the whole people, except for a few public officers." The whole people. That's pretty simple. Richard Henry Lee in The Federal Farmer, number 18, on June 25, 1788, said, "A militia, when properly formed, are in fact the people themselves, and include, according to the past and general usage of the states, all men capable of bearing arms." To preserve liberty, it is essential that the whole body of the people always possess arms and be taught alike, especially when young, how to use them. I'm not going to go any further into that. I think those couple of quotes make it very obvious that, and I'll talk about why later, but the militia was not any formal fighting force. It was the people capable of bearing arms. Okay, the next phrase in this thing, a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state. There's a topic that we can debate whether or not it's applicable to today. That's not my purpose right now. My purpose is to let you know what the founders felt when they wrote the document, when they wrote the amendment. Okay? Representative Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts said in the first Annals of Congress 750 on August 17th, 1789, "What, sir, is the use of the militia? It is to prevent the establishment of a standing army, the bane of liberty. Whenever governments mean to invade the rights and liberties of the people, they always attempt to destroy the militia in order to raise an army upon their ruins." So, what did we learn about a well-regulated militia? That it's the people capable of bearing arms. How do you destroy that? You take the arms away. Whenever governments mean to invade the rights and liberties of the people, they always attempt to destroy the militia in order to raise an army upon their ruins. Noah Webster said in an examination of the leading principles of the federal Constitution on October 10, 1787, "Before a standing army can rule, the people must be disarmed, as they are in almost every country in Europe. The supreme power in America cannot enforce unjust laws by the sword, because the whole body of the people are armed and constitute a force superior to any band of regular troops. This militia, the people capable of bearing arms, are intended and thought of as by the founding fathers as a body to repel a tyrannical government that had raised a standing army against them." Now, you can debate whether armed people today could conceivably constitute a superior force to any band of regular troops, because we're so undergunned, we don't have the same armaments that they do. By numbers, there are multiples more armed Americans than there are civilians, than there are soldiers, than there are National Guard. And we can have a debate on whether or not the people should be so badly underarmed. But that's quite another question for another day. The point being that being necessary to the security of a free state. The security of the free state depends on being able to resist tyranny. Patrick Henry, you remember him, "Give me liberty or give me death," in his speech to the Virginia Ratifying Convention on June 5th, 1778, said, "Guard with jealous attention the public liberty. Suspect everyone who approaches that jewel. Unfortunately, nothing will preserve it but downright force. Whenever you give up that force, you are ruined. The great object is that every man be armed. Everyone who is able might have a gun." Why? Because we go back to his opening sentence in the same quote, "Guard with jealous attention the public liberty, suspect everyone who approaches that jewel." Because the Founding Fathers knew that it would come under attack at some point, and indeed it is under attack today. Now let's move on to the next phrase of the Second Amendment. "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to bear arms." And there's a comma, so that's where I'm going to stop for a moment. The right of the people to bear arms Let's talk about that for a minute and see what Thomas Jefferson said in a letter to John Cartwright on June 5, 1824. The Constitution of most of the states and of the United States assert that all power is inherent in the people, that they may exercise it by themselves, that it is their duty, right and duty to be armed at all times. It is their right and duty to be armed at all times. The right of the people to keep and bear arms. George Washington said in the first annual address to Congress in January 8, 1780, a free people ought not only to be armed, but disciplined. And the meaning of the term discipline in the 1700s was able to use that firearm and very comfortable with it. A free people ought not only to be armed, but disciplined. Samuel Adams, you recognize that name, said to the Massachusetts Ratifying Committee and Convention in 1788, "The Constitution shall never be construed to prevent the people of the United States who are peaceable citizens from keeping their own arms, the right of the people to bear arms. The Constitution shall never be construed to prevent the people of the United States who are peaceable citizens from keeping their arms." I think that's clear, and I think you can probably see a pretty clear pattern emerging. And now we're going to go to the last phrase of the Second Amendment, and now I'm going to read the whole thing and add the last phrase. "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." That is so plain, I don't know why it's subject to debate today, but it is. So let's see what it means from the mouths of the founders, and only a couple of these. Thomas Jefferson, in the Virginia State Constitution, his first draft of the Constitution, he said, "No free man shall ever be debarred the use of arms." Shall not be infringed. No free man shall ever be debarred the use of arms. James Madison said in the first Annals of Congress 434, June 8, 1789, and he almost quotes the Second Amendment, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. A well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people trained to arms is the best and most natural defense of a free country." And that quote kind of encapsulates it all, right? I want to go to Thomas Paine. In his Thoughts on Defensive War in Pennsylvania Magazine, July 1775, we're moving on to the self-defense aspect. "The supposed quietude of a good man allures the ruffian, while on the other hand, arms, like the law, discourage and keep the invader and the plunderer in awe, and preserve order in the world as well as property. The balance of power is the scale of peace. The same balance would be preserved were all the world destitute of arms, for all would be alike. But since some will not, others dare not lay them aside." And what he's saying is that we need to be able to protect ourselves. We need to be able to protect ourselves. If you could only get weapons out of the hands of criminals and people intent on doing you harm, you wouldn't have to have one. But they're not going to lay down their arms, and Thomas Paine says others dare not lay them aside. Now here's another interesting aspect to bearing arms, and this talks about the long, hard tradition in America of the shooting sports. And Thomas Jefferson was writing a letter to Peter Carr, who was facing some personal difficulty, in August 19, 1785, and giving him some advice. Here's what he said: "A strong body makes the mind strong. As to the species of exercise, I advise the gun. While it gives moderate exercise to the body, it gives boldness, enterprise, and independence to the mind. Games played with the ball and others of that nature are too violent for the body and stamp no character on the mind. Let your gun, therefore, be your constant companion of your walks. You know what? If you need to relax and contemplate, some people want to knit, crochet, drive their car. Other people want to go to the shooting range. It's cathartic. It's almost zen-like to people who enjoy it. You don't enjoy it, don't do it. Don't take that right away from others. Okay? So, I'm going to bring this to a summary. We talked about several reasons why it's important that the right to keep and bear arms not be infringed. We talked about defending liberty, safeguarding against tyranny, exercising an unalienable right. We talked about self-defense, and we talked about just enjoyment, which some people do. You don't have to. That's fine. Other people do. There's several reasons that the right to keep and bear arms should not be infringed upon. Is this the end of the conversation for me? No. There are a lot of things that we haven't talked about yet. We'll talk about them later. Those things are, in part, are the concerns of the founders still valid today in the 21st century? That's a valid topic to talk about. What arms are appropriate for civilian ownership? That's important because of all the yelling about military-style assault weapons, things like that. So what arms are appropriate for civilians? Should the right be limited for public safety concerns, and what is the line we draw there? Certainly we don't want crazy people who are dangerous having guns. How do we do that, etc., etc. And we could also talk about concealed carry under the Second Amendment. These are other things to talk about, but what I hope I made the point today was what the founders intended when they wrote the Second Amendment. Now, I gave you enough information that if you disagree with me, if you think I took something out of context, you can go back, research it, and let me know. And in fact, I encourage you to, because I'm that confident in my research that I took absolutely nothing out of context. I told you today what the Founding Fathers intended when they wrote the Second Amendment. If you disagree, let me know. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, follow me on Facebook, email me, call me if you've got my number. Let's talk. Let's have a conversation. Thanks. I'm going to sign off for now. Have a nice day.